The Royal Moon Masquerade had been underway for 2 hours before I let myself breathe normally again. And even then, I only allowed it in careful, measured amounts, the way I measured everything that mattered. Thousands of candles burned in the mirrored walls of the sun chamber's outer hall, doubling and tripling themselves in the glass, until the whole room seemed to shiver with light. Winter flowers floated in bowls of clear water, suspended from silver chains above the dance floor, their petals white as the snow falling silently beyond the tall windows. Somewhere above the orchestra's strings, laughter kept rising and breaking like waves against rock, and beneath all of it moved the low murmur of a court that had gathered, officially, to celebrate the turning of the season, and unofficially, to watch their queen choose a bride. Alpha scents drifted through carefully filtered ventilation, cedar and leather and warm metal, blended just enough by the palace engineers to keep the evening bearable for the dozens of Omegas moving through the crowd in their family's jewels. Servants carried trays of dark wine between clusters of guests, whose whispers moved faster than the music itself. And beyond the tall windows, the snow kept falling over banners bearing the royal crest, steady and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. I was not here to be chosen. I was here to disappear. My mask was dark blue enamel, painted with hairline cracks of silver that ran across the surface like a frozen river seen from above. It had cost me nearly a month's wages, and I had chosen it deliberately, plain enough not to draw a second glance, elegant enough that no one would question why a woman claiming to be a lowly restoration assistant had been permitted inside the palace at all. My invitation charm, sewn into the lining of my glove, read Beta, the same false word that had sat on my palace registration for 6 years. The herbal ribbon knotted beneath my bodice, suppressed what the charm could not disguise on its own. Every piece of the lie had been assembled with the same care I gave to repairing a 300-year-old manuscript, stitch by stitch, until it looked whole enough to fool anyone who did not know to look for the seams. I only needed 30 minutes. The musician's corridor led to a servant's stair, the servant's stair led to the Western Archive, and the Western Archive held records that had been sealed since before I was born, including, I believed, the true account of what had happened to my mother. Across the hall, near the dais, Queen Thalia Corven was rejecting another Omega. I had watched her do it 11 times already that evening, and each rejection looked exactly like the last from a distance. A brief exchange, a small incline of her head, a retreat that the noble family tried to disguise as satisfaction. She never raised her voice. She never embarrassed anyone in front of the room, though the court seemed disappointed by that restraint, as if they had come hoping for blood and kept receiving only quiet, devastating politeness instead. They called her the Winter Queen, and looking at her from across a crowded ballroom, I understood exactly why. She stood with the stillness of someone who had trained herself out of every unnecessary motion, dressed in silver and deep gray, her own mask a simple half-shield of hammered steel that left her mouth and jaw visible and nothing else. Even from this distance, her presence had weight, the particular gravity of a person who had learned that other people rearranged themselves around her, whether she asked them to or not. I told myself I did not care what she looked like up close. I told myself this while counting the exits, while watching the current of dancers for the moment it would thin enough to let me slip toward the corridor unnoticed. I told myself this right up until the moment a young lord, half a glass of wine into his evening, and entirely too pleased with his own dancing, spun a partner directly into me. The wine went everywhere, down my sleeve, across my bodice, soaking straight through the herbal ribbon before I understood what had happened. I apologized for a collision that was not mine, accepted his flustered apology in return, and stepped back into the crowd already calculating how quickly I could reach a washroom to salvage what I could. I did not yet understand that it was too late for salvage. The ribbon's coating had been designed to withstand sweat and dancing, and the ordinary damp of a long evening, not raw spirits poured directly onto it. Within minutes, whatever it had been holding back began, quietly and irreversibly, to rise. I felt the change before I understood it. A prickling awareness along my skin, a warmth I associated with careless mornings alone in my workshop, never with a ballroom full of alphas. I told myself it was nothing. I kept walking toward the corridor. Across the hall, Queen Thalia Corven stopped listening to the noble family in front of her mid-sentence. I did not see this happen. I felt the room notice it happening, the way you feel weather change before you see the clouds, a ripple of attention moving outward from the dais. When I finally looked, her head had lifted, and her eyes, gray as the mask beneath them, were moving through the crowd with the focus of someone tracking a single thread through a tapestry. She was looking for something. I understood, with a lurch that went straight to my stomach, that she had found it. She crossed the ballroom the way water finds the lowest point, without hurry, without visible effort, and yet the entire room parted for her as though it had been waiting all evening for exactly this. Conversations stopped. The orchestra did not stop, but I stopped hearing it. I began, with the flat calm of pure panic, to calculate exits again, and found that every one of them now required walking toward her rather than away. She stopped several feet from me, not close enough to crowd me, close enough that I understood the distance was a choice. "Who are you?" she said. It was not phrased as a question, though it functioned as one. I gave her the surname I had used for 6 years, the one stitched as carefully into my life as into my invitation charm. She studied me for a long moment, her gaze moving from the crack of silver on my mask down to my throat, where I imagined, with humiliating certainty, that she could see my pulse. "You are not a beta," she said, quietly enough that only I could hear it over the strings. "I don't know what you mean, Your Majesty." "I think you do." Something in her voice was not cruel, which surprised me more than the accusation itself. It sounded almost like grief. For 7 years I have stood in front of women my counsel assured me were compatible, and felt nothing that frightened me. You are wearing a lie so thin I could put my hand through it, and my instincts are telling me things about you that should be impossible. A pause, precise as a blade. Then someone has taught my instincts to lie, or someone has taught you to. I told her, with more steadiness than I felt, that I was simply an assistant who had spilled wine on herself and had nowhere better to be. High Chancellor Neris Valtaine was approaching from the dais, her sharp eyes already narrowing on the scene, and I understood that if palace officials examined my registration too closely tonight, I would never see the inside of the Western Archive at all. Not tonight, not ever, because I would be in a cell. A cluster of masked dancers moved between us, laughing, oblivious, and I used the gap the way I would have used any tool in my workshop, precisely and without hesitation, slipping sideways into the crowd and away. I did not look back to see whether she ordered guards after me. Later, I would learn that she had not. She had simply watched me go, and let me. Before we return to the story, a quick note for my lovely viewers. While this YouTube series keeps things safe, my Patreon is where the real fun happens. That's where you'll find completely uncensored GL stories, much hotter exclusive videos, and bolder adventures that are just too spicy for YouTube. If you want the full, no-limits experience, and to support more of this kind of storytelling, the Patreon link is in the description below. I made it as far as the Moon Garden, an enclosed winter courtyard behind the musicians' corridor, before my hands started shaking too badly to be useful. Pale trees stood black against the snow, their branches strung with lanterns that turned the falling flakes gold as they drifted past. I found a stone bench beside a frozen fountain and tried, with fumbling fingers, to press a fresh layer of suppressant paste beneath the ruined ribbon, cursing myself for not carrying a spare. "It won't help now," said a voice behind me. "The reaction has already started. You'll only irritate the skin." I turned, and there she was, standing several paces back at the garden's entrance, her guards nowhere in sight. She had dismissed them, I realized. She had come alone, or as close to alone as a reigning queen was ever permitted to be. "Are you going to arrest me?" I said, because there seemed no point pretending any longer. I could. She did not move closer. I noticed that, and filed it away, the way I filed away the ink dates and the wax textures of documents I could not yet explain. "You've falsified a royal designation, entered my palace under false pretenses, and I have no idea yet what else you've done tonight. I have every legal right to have you questioned before morning." "But you're not. I'm asking whether you're in danger." The question surprised me so thoroughly that for a moment I forgot to be afraid. An Omega hiding her designation inside a palace full of alphas On the one night we're guaranteed to be at our worst. That is either extraordinary recklessness or extraordinary need. I would like to know which. I told her, with more honesty than strategy, that the danger tonight was standing in front of me wearing a crown. She absorbed the insult without flinching, the ghost of something that might, on a different woman, have been amusement crossing her mouth. "You are not entirely wrong," she said. "Tell me why you're here." I refused. She did not press. Instead, she asked why. If she despised these selection evenings so thoroughly, she continued holding them at all, and she answered a question I had not actually voiced aloud, as though she had heard it in the set of my shoulders. Because sometimes wearing a crown means being required to perform your own captivity beautifully, for an audience that mistakes the performance for consent. The bells announcing the next formal dance rang out from the hall behind us. I made to leave. She asked, simply, whether I would dance with her. I refused that too. She accepted the refusal without argument, which unsettled me more than pursuit would have. "I won't expose your designation tonight," she said, as I turned to go. "I don't believe you." "Good," she said. "That may be the wisest thing you've done since you walked into my palace." I found the Western Archive through the old servant's stair, exactly where the smuggled floor plans had promised. Its iron cabinets locked with a mechanism 30 years out of date, the kind of lock my restoration training had taught me to open without leaving a mark. Dust lay thick over centuries of correspondence. A single low fire burned in a far grate, more for the preservation of the vellum than for any human comfort. I found the Solmere records within the hour, my family's crest pressed into cracked red wax, and it took me only minutes more to understand that something was deeply wrong with what I was looking at. The ink was too new. I had spent 6 years learning to read paper, the way other people read faces. The formula used in the supposed confession, attributed to my mother, in the supposed witness statements dated to her trial, had not existed 15 years ago. It had been developed by the Royal Chancellery only 8 years past. Someone had rewritten my mother's treason record, and rewritten it recently. The archive smelled of dust and tallow smoke, and the particular dry mineral scent of very old vellum, a smell I had loved since childhood, long before I understood it would become my profession, rather than simply my comfort. Tall ladders leaned against shelving that reached higher than any private library I had ever worked in, and behind decorative panels bearing the crests of a dozen noble houses, entire generations of correspondence sat boxed and largely forgotten, waiting for a restorer patient enough to care what any of it actually said. I moved through it methodically, the way I had trained myself to move through any collection, cataloging before touching, noting before disturbing, until I reached the modest, unassuming box marked with my own family's crest, smaller by half than the boxes belonging to houses that had never once been accused of treason. I was still copying passages with trembling hands when the door opened behind me and Queen Thalia Corven walked in, no longer performing patience. "You broke into a sealed state archive," she said, and this time there was real fury in it, sharper than anything at the ball, nothing to do with designation, and everything to do with the documents scattered across the table. "Do you understand what you've done?" I understood, finally, that I was tired of hiding from her, and I removed my mask. Whatever she had expected to see, it clearly was not my face, and for a long moment neither of us spoke. Then her eyes dropped to the paper beneath my hand, to the crest pressed into red wax, and I watched something shift behind her expression, recognition arriving like weather. "Solmere," she said, "there was a missing child. I was told she died years ago, in the countryside, of fever." "I did not die of fever," I said. "I was smuggled out under another name while my mother rotted in a cell for a crime I don't believe she committed. She could have called for guards then. She did not. Instead, she crossed to the table, examined the ink herself with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had been trained to read treaties for hidden clauses, and confirmed, in a voice gone very quiet, that I was right about the dates. She did not take the documents from me. She locked them into a secure evidence cabinet and placed the only key into my hand. "If these were forged," she said, "you deserve to know the truth more than anyone alive. But if someone inside my own crown falsified a treason case, we investigate carefully, or Neris destroys the rest of the evidence before we ever find it. Will you help me learn what actually happened to your mother? I agreed to a temporary alliance. I made certain she understood that alliance was not loyalty. I would have been disappointed, she said, if it were. I expected the next morning to be arrested after all. Instead, I was summoned to a small breakfast room I had not known existed. No counsel present, no guards standing over me. Only Thalia, 2 cups of tea going cold, and my scent ribbon lying repaired and untouched on the table between us. I checked it, out of habit born from years of professional distrust, and found no trace that any sample had been taken from it. That, more than anything she had said the night before, earned her the smallest possible measure of trust. She proposed that I join the Royal Archive Restoration Commission under my true qualifications, which would give me legitimate access to any document connected to the Solmere case. In exchange, I would help her identify whatever else in the Royal Archive might have been quietly rewritten over the years. I refused payment at first. Out of pride I couldn't fully justify. She told me with a dryness I had not expected from the Winter Queen, that unpaid royal labor was simply exploitation with better lighting. I accepted a salary. I also, without meaning to, moved the honeypot out of her reach, having noticed the small flinch that crossed her face each time the staff set it beside her plate. The next morning, it did not appear again. I learned later that it had been a standing tradition since her sister's death, one nobody had dared correct. I had corrected it without thinking, and Thalia had noticed that I had. The weeks that followed did not unfold the way I expected them to. I had imagined, if I imagined anything at all, a slow and predictable siege, an Alpha Queen, wearing down an Omega's resistance through persistence and proximity. Instead, I found a woman who argued with me about monarchy until midnight in a dust-choked reading room, insisting that duty and freedom were not always opposites, while I insisted, just as stubbornly, that anyone born into that much power found it convenient to believe so. I discovered she was ferociously, almost embarrassingly competitive in the palace fencing gallery, the first time she invited me to watch her practice, and I made the mistake of laughing at her form. She handed me a blunted foil before I could apologize, and spent the next hour proving, with increasing and undignified determination, that a woman who negotiated treaties for a living could also be beaten by an archivist who had fenced exactly twice in her life, purely out of spite. She lost the 4th match on purpose, I was almost certain, and refused for weeks afterward to admit it. I found a woman who once laughed so hard in a private library, over an old satirical pamphlet mocking one of her own ancestors, that she had to sit down on the library steps to recover, and I realized, with a small shock that lodged somewhere under my ribs, that I had never heard the sound before in 7 years of court gossip about her coldness, and that I wanted, badly, to hear it again. I found a woman who disguised herself in an ordinary wool coat, her crown left behind and her hair pinned plainly beneath a scarf, to walk with me through the winter market on a gray afternoon when neither of us had anywhere else we needed to be. She stood very still beside a stall of dried herbs, listening, while a fishmonger complained bitterly to his neighbor about the crown consort law and the way it had cost his own niece a marriage she'd actually wanted, entirely unaware that he stood 3 feet from the crown itself. Thalia bought a paper cone of roasted chestnuts afterward and ate them in silence the whole walk back to the palace gate, and when I asked what she was thinking, she said only that she had spent 7 years hearing what her council wanted her to believe her people thought, and almost none of what they actually said when they thought no one was listening. There was an evening at the Royal Observatory, high above the coldest part of the palace roofline, where she showed me the positions of stars her father had once made her memorize as a child, reciting navigational names in a flat, dutiful voice that made it clear the lessons had never once felt like wonder to her. I asked when she had last come up here simply to look at the sky rather than to recite something. She thought about it for longer than the question should have required, and admitted, finally, that she could not remember the last time she had slept through an entire night without waking to check on some crisis, real or imagined, and that the stars, lately, had become just another thing she inspected rather than something she was permitted to enjoy. I told her that sounded exhausting. She told me that exhaustion was simply what ruling felt like, most days, and that she had stopped noticing it until I'd started asking questions no one else bothered to ask. We were caught, once, in an early autumn storm on the road back from a records vault 2 days outside the capital, and had no choice but to take the last available room at a cramped roadside inn, 1 bed and 1 narrow chair between us. Neither of us mentioned rank. She took the chair without being asked, and fell asleep sitting upright with her coat still buttoned, and I lay awake half the night furious with myself for wishing, uselessly, that she had chosen otherwise, and even more furious at how relieved I was that she hadn't asked. There was a lantern festival in the lower city in early winter, thousands of paper lights released over the river at dusk, and Thalia walked beside me through the crush of the crowd with her hands carefully folded behind her back the entire evening, and I understood, eventually, watching her glance down at my hand and then quickly away, that she was waiting, with visible effort, for me to be the one who closed the distance first. When I finally slid my fingers into hers, she went very still for a moment, the way I imagined she went still before a difficult negotiation, and then her hand tightened around mine, as if she had been waiting all evening for permission she refused to ask for outright. And there was a frozen lake outside the old hunting lodge, in the coldest week of that first winter together, where I finally told her what it had felt like to grow up believing my own mother was a traitor, to flinch at the Solmere name whenever a stranger used it, to build an entire adult life around the careful, exhausting art of being unremarkable, so that no one would ever look closely enough to ask who I really was. Thalia did not try to comfort me with easy reassurances. She listened, the whole way through, without interrupting, and when I finally finished, she said only that she was sorry it had taken a stranger with a crown 15 years to notice something my own government should have corrected the moment it happened. It was, I think, the single most romantic thing anyone had ever said to me, precisely because it wasn't trying to be. I also found, hidden in a locked drawer in her private study, a decade's worth of failed proposals to abolish that same law. She told me about the first candidates the council had sent her, praised for their fertility histories, and their scent compatibility, and their temperament, as though they were livestock rather than women. She told me about the one who had begged her, privately, not to be chosen, because she wanted to finish her medical training. Thalia had rejected her publicly, and let the court believe her heartless, because the alternative was explaining that she was protecting the woman from a life she never wanted. She told me about another, who loved someone already, and how Thalia had rejected her too, for the same silent reason. It should have made me trust her completely. Instead, I told her that quietly protecting individual women did not fix a law that would keep hurting every Omega who came after them. She agreed, without defensiveness, that I was right, and said that was precisely why she needed proof strong enough to burn the law down entirely, not merely spare a few of its victims. We found that proof, piece by piece, in places that were never comfortable. In a midnight restoration session where I taught her to identify a forged wax seal by the grain of its cooling pattern, and she taught me, in turn, how patient a person could be while furious. In a palace kitchen where we hid together from an unwanted council delegation and ate bread meant for the scullery staff, laughing under our breath like children. In a carriage through heavy snow to the abandoned Solmere estate, its gates rusted shut, and its gardens gone entirely wild, the family crest above the door so weathered it was barely legible beneath 15 years of neglect. I walked rooms I had not seen since I was 12 years old, and felt each one arrive like a small, separate grief. In the old chapel, its windows broken and its pews thick with dust, I found my mother's handwriting carved into the underside of a bench, a private code only the two of us had ever shared, one she had taught me as a game, before I understood she was also teaching me how to leave messages no one else would ever think to look for. I traced the letters with my fingers and wept in a way I had not allowed myself to since the night the palace guards first came for her. Thalia did not touch me while I cried. She simply stayed close enough that I could reach for her if I chose to, and I did. We learned, together, what my mother had actually discovered before her death. 15 years earlier, King Orin and several members of his council had been using the crown consort law and its lesser cousins to threaten noble families through their Omega daughters, hiding land transfers inside bonding contracts, absorbing entire estates into the crown through marriages no one had genuinely chosen. Mariel Solmir, a legal scholar who had spent years publicly opposing the law, uncovered the pattern and intended to expose it. Nerys Valtaine, already the king's most trusted administrator, helped fabricate the evidence that sent her to prison instead. Thalia did not know, as a young princess, what her father had done. When the truth became undeniable, she did not defend him. I watched grief and disgust and something close to shame move across her face, and I did not comfort her immediately, because my own mother had died for the actions those emotions were arriving 15 years too late to prevent. Being ignorant of it, she said finally, did not make the crown innocent of it. I told her I agreed, and that agreeing did not make the years I had spent without a mother any shorter. There was a night, in the middle of all that work, when the strain of everything finally caught up with my body rather than my mind. I had missed 2 doses of suppressant in the chaos of a records deadline, and I felt the warning arrive the way I always did, a low warmth spreading under my skin, my scent sharpening in a way that made 2 of the junior archivists suddenly find urgent business elsewhere. I knew my own body well enough to know it was only a warning, not an emergency, days away from anything serious. But Thalia, when she found me gripping the edge of a reading table with my eyes shut, went pale in a way I had never seen on her. "I can leave," she said immediately, already stepping back toward the door. "I'll send for your physician, and I'll leave the wing entirely. You don't have to." "Stay," I said, surprising us both. She stopped in the doorway, clearly torn between instinct and discipline, and chose discipline, the way she always did when it mattered. She stayed on the far side of the room, near the window, giving me every inch of space I might have needed, and did not move closer even when I could see, in the tightness along her jaw, exactly what it was costing her to hold that distance. I asked her, eventually, in a voice smaller than I intended, whether I could have her scent, and she crossed the room only far enough to drape her own coat over the back of my chair, close enough that the scent of frost-crushed rosemary and warm parchment settled around me without her ever touching my skin. It helped more than any medicine had. When I finally asked her to sit beside me, she did, carefully, keeping a full arm's width of air between us, and we stayed like that in silence until the warning passed on its own, hours later, leaving me embarrassed and strangely, thoroughly comforted. "You could have simply held me," I told her afterward, half joking, half not. "I could have," she agreed. "I decided a long time ago that what I want is mine to manage, not your burden to accommodate. Wanting you does not obligate you to anything." She said it so plainly, as though it were the most obvious fact in the world, that it took me a full day to understand how extraordinary a thing she had actually said. It was that same restraint, oddly, that finally made me lose patience with her. "Do you actually want me?" I asked her one evening, weeks later, when she had once again excused herself from a room the moment the air between us grew too warm, "or are you simply trying very hard not to?" She turned back at the door, and for once, she did not have a composed answer ready. "I want you," she said, with an intensity that frightens me more than anything in this palace ever has. That is exactly why I keep leaving the room. We uncovered more, in scattered pieces, over the months that followed. An old reference, buried in a monastery's index, to an original version of the Crown Consort Charter that predated all the amendments currently governing royal marriage. I began to hope that if we found it, we would find the proof that the entire modern law rested on manipulation, rather than tradition. The first kiss happened at the Solmir estate, on a gray afternoon, when we found a hidden room behind my mother's old study, its shelves lined with copies of the legal research she had never lived to publish. Among them was a letter she had written to me as a child, sealed and never sent, full of small, ordinary hopes for a daughter she must have known. Even then, she might not live to see grow up. I read it twice before the words blurred entirely, and Thalia stayed near me without touching me, the way she always did, close enough to reach and careful never to close the last of the distance herself. "Why do you always wait?" I asked her, my voice wrecked, "instead of just holding me?" "Because too many people who wore this crown before me never waited for anything," she said. I decided a long time ago I would rather be patient than be like them. I crossed the distance myself, then, and kissed her. She went completely still, more from shock than hesitation, and then, very carefully, she pulled back just far enough to ask if I was certain, her voice low and rough in a way I had never heard from her. I told her yes. Only then did she kiss me back, and it was nothing like I had braced myself for, nothing possessive or hurried. It felt like years of anger and loneliness, and wanting finally colliding all at once. And when we finally broke apart, we were both breathing as though we'd run somewhere. It did not make anything simpler. If anything, it made everything after that afternoon more complicated, because now we both had something specific to lose. Rumors began moving through the capital not long after, the way rumors always did, faster than any official statement could catch them. Servants had noticed a masked woman entering restricted royal rooms at odd hours. A gossip pamphlet speculated, in breathless and largely invented detail, that the Winter Queen had finally chosen a secret consort and was simply too proud to announce her. I hated it more than I expected to, the way strangers discussed my body and my designation as though I were a puzzle the court had finally solved, rather than a person who happened to be standing in a doorway at the wrong hour. Thalia refused, publicly and repeatedly, to confirm or identify me, which protected my privacy exactly as intended and created an entirely different wound in its place. I began to wonder, in the small hours when doubt is always at its loudest, whether her silence was protection or embarrassment, whether some part of her preferred that the kingdom never learn precisely who she had let close. I asked her directly, because 6 years of hiding had taught me that unasked questions rot faster than answered ones. She looked for a moment, genuinely startled that I would think it, and then, carefully, she explained that she was not hiding me out of shame. She was refusing to announce a relationship I had never agreed, myself, to define in public, because the last thing she intended to do was make that choice for me the way every consort before me had had it made for them. I realized, hearing that she had left the decision entirely in my hands, and that the discomfort I'd been feeling wasn't really about her silence at all. It was about how unfamiliar it felt to be the one actually holding a choice that mattered. Then I discovered something Thalia had never told me, and everything I had begun to believe about her cracked straight down the center. Nearly 2 years before I ever set foot in her palace, Thalia had found a suspicious fragment in her father's private correspondence and ordered a quiet investigation into the Solmere case herself. That investigation had failed to produce conclusive proof. Rather than reopen a 15-year-old treason conviction publicly without enough evidence to survive Neris's counterattack, she had sealed the incomplete report and told herself she was waiting for a moment safe enough to finish what she'd started. She had known, in some unfinished, uncertain form, for 2 years, that my mother might have been innocent, and she had said nothing, not even after she learned exactly who I was. "How many years?" I asked her, in a voice I barely recognized as my own. Was a dead woman supposed to wait for the crown to feel comfortable enough to tell the truth? She had no answer that satisfied either of us. She told me she had feared that reopening the case without proof would let Neris destroy what little evidence remained before we ever found it, and that every day she delayed felt like a wager she couldn't be certain she was right to make. I told her that might all be true, and it still did not erase what it had cost me to grow up believing my mother was a traitor, while the one person capable of clearing her name decided the timing wasn't yet convenient. "Did you bring me into this because you loved me?" I asked her. "Or because the last living Solmere heir turned out to be politically useful evidence?" "Both things can be true, and neither erase the other," she said. "My feelings for you are real. That does not make what I did to you fair." "That may be true," I told her, "and it still isn't enough." She did not raise her voice. Not once, through the entire argument, which somehow made it worse. She told me she understood if I could not forgive the delay, and that she would not use anything between us. Not the bond neither of us had made yet, not the crown, not even her own grief, to demand that I stay and hear her out further than I already had. I told her I needed her to understand that I had spent 15 years being told my mother's name was a crime, and that finding out the one person capable of ending that lie had chosen caution over honesty felt like being lied to a second time by someone I had actually let myself trust. She said she understood. She did not ask me to reconsider. I left the palace that night. She let me go. For several weeks I did not see her. She did not come to my workshop uninvited. She sent no excessive gifts, placed no guards outside my door, used no royal authority to force a reconciliation I hadn't offered. What she sent, once, was a copy of every previously sealed Solmere document, along with a signed order permanently transferring legal custody of the originals to the public archive, out of her own control entirely. She also introduced legislation requiring royal archives to open automatically after 20 years, so that no future monarch could bury a truth the way her father had buried mine. It did not make me forgive her. It told me, at least, that she had heard me. I missed her in small, humiliating ways I hadn't expected. The exact pause before she said something dry enough to catch me off guard. The way she pretended not to enjoy the pastries I brought her, and always finished them anyway, her scent lingering faintly on the archive pages we had spent so many nights reading together, something like frost-crushed rosemary and old parchment warmed near a fire, warmer than either of those things whenever she'd been near me too long. I saw her, occasionally, from a distance, in public speeches about reforming the Crown's oldest laws, refusing every time to name me, protecting a privacy I had never actually asked her to protect, and resenting, at the same time, that she'd left the choice entirely mine. I kept investigating on my own, with 2 colleagues from the public archive I trusted, and eventually traced the reference to the original Crown Consort Charter to a monastery in the mountains beyond the capital. I went without telling Thalia, because we were no longer people who told each other things. The monastery itself sat carved into a granite shoulder of mountain, 3 days' ride beyond the last proper road, reachable only by a track the monks kept clear with hand shovels through most of the winter. It felt older than the capital by centuries, its corridors lit with oil lamps instead of the palace's endless candles, its silence so complete that I found myself lowering my voice without meaning to, as though the mountain itself might overhear something it wasn't ready to know. The archivist there, an elderly beta named Brother Ossian, who had spent 40 years cataloging documents nobody in the capital remembered existed, led me down 2 flights of stone stairs to a chamber that had not been opened, by his own account, in over a generation. We found the charter wrapped in oiled cloth inside a cedar chest, its pages brittle but legible, the royal seal at its foot unmistakably genuine in a way the modern amendments, I would soon learn, were not. I had barely begun copying the opening clauses when Brother Ossian's novice came sprinting down the stairs, breathless, to warn us that armed riders had reached the gate carrying royal orders. Neris learned of the journey before I reached the pass. She sent officers carrying orders that looked legitimate at a glance, and were not, forged with a seal I recognized as false the instant I saw it, close enough to the old imperfection I'd been trained for years to catch, a seal cut from a die that had been retired from the royal chancellery a full decade earlier. I escaped through an old mountain passage, with the monastery's archivist just ahead of them, the charter wrapped tight against my chest beneath my coat, and a storm closed the pass behind us before either of us could reach shelter. We spent 2 nights in a shepherd's stone hut half buried in drifted snow, rationing a single loaf of bread between us, and taking turns watching the door, and I had more time than I wanted to consider what would happen if Neris's men found us first, or if the cold finished what they hadn't managed to. Thalia learned what had happened from the legitimate royal guard, not from me, and rode out herself with a small escort through weather no sensible monarch should have risked. When she found me, half frozen in the monastery's stone hall, she was furious and terrified in equal measure, and she did not scold me for leaving without telling her. I pointed that out. "I've finally learned," she said, "that there's a difference between wishing you had told me and believing you needed my permission." The charter, when we finally read it together by firelight, confirmed everything my mother must have suspected. The original Crown Consort law had never been designed as a cage. It had granted Royal Omegas equal property rights, independent political identity, and the explicit right to refuse a bond entirely. Every restriction currently governing royal marriage had been added generations later, through amendments that were never legally ratified, suppressed by families, Nereus's among them, who profited from the version that replaced it. We rode back toward the capital together over 3 slow days, the mountain passes giving way gradually to the gentler hills nearer home, the silence between us careful rather than comfortable, both of us conscious of how easily either of us might say the wrong thing, and undo whatever fragile ground we had managed to rebuild on that mountainside. We were not yet reconciled, and we both seemed to know it, and there was a strange, aching honesty in simply admitting that to each other, rather than pretending otherwise. At a roadside inn during the last night of the journey, she apologized without asking me to forgive her for it. She told me she had loved me before she had learned how to love someone without trying to manage every danger around her, and that the two things were not the same skill, though she had let herself believe otherwise for far too long. I admitted in turn that part of my anger had been armor, because loving her frightened me for reasons that had nothing to do with what she was, and everything to do with what she ruled. Loving the queen of an entire kingdom meant I might never know exactly where her private love for me ended and her public duty began. "I can't promise duty will never hurt you again," she said. "I can promise I will never again decide, on your behalf, that you're safer not knowing something." We did not fully reconcile that night, but I fell asleep with my hand resting near hers on the blanket between us, close enough to reach, and in the morning it was still there. The final confrontation came not at another ball, but inside the ancient sun chamber, on the morning of Thalia's succession deadline, before the assembled houses of the realm. The chamber itself was unlike anything I had stood inside before, a vast half-circle of pale stone, carved 4 centuries earlier, its high windows built to let dawn light fall directly across the throne, at the exact hour formal sessions began, so that every monarch who had ever sat there had been required, quite literally, to face the sunrise while making the kingdom's hardest decisions. Banners of every noble house hung from the gallery rail, and beneath them sat generations of accumulated portraits, unsmiling queens and kings who had, I suspected, faced fewer honest choices in that room than were about to be made this particular morning. Omega representatives crowded the public galleries for the first time in the chamber's long history, admitted only because the demonstrations gathering outside the palace walls had grown too large to safely ignore. I had walked past the edge of that crowd on my way in, thousands of people standing in the cold holding signs bearing my mother's name, alongside dozens of others, women and Omegas of every designation whose stories had never made it into any official record, and the sight of it had nearly undone whatever composure I'd managed to gather that morning. Nereus invoked the old clause herself. Thalia had failed, she declared, to secure the dynasty either through an heir or a recognized consort, and the assembly must now choose between appointing Lady Sabra Corven as successor or forcing Thalia to name a crown consort that very hour. Then, with the satisfaction of someone certain she had already won, she revealed my identity to the entire chamber, an unregistered Omega, the surviving daughter of a convicted traitor, a woman who had entered the Royal Masquerade under a false designation and illegally accessed the royal archives, and, she added, with visible relish, the Queen's own scent-compatible match. If Thalia rejected me publicly, Nereus believed, she would lose whatever this was between us forever, in front of the entire realm. If she claimed me, she would validate the very law she had spent years secretly fighting to destroy. If she refused to answer at all, the assembly could strip her authority over the succession outright. I walked into the sun chamber before Thalia could answer, carrying the original charter, and removed my mask. The sound that moved through the gallery was not quite a gasp and not quite silence. Something suspended between the two, 400 nobles and 1,000 strangers all recalculating, in the same instant, exactly who I was and what my presence meant. "My name is Era Mariel Solmare," I said, to a chamber gone utterly silent. I did not apologize for the false designation. I explained, instead, precisely why Omegas like me were forced into that particular lie, describing the doors that closed the moment disclosure was made, the Restoration Guild that would have refused my apprenticeship outright had they known what I was, the 6 years I had spent teaching myself to move through elite professional spaces as something I was not, simply to be trusted with the work I had trained my entire life to do. I watched several of the assembled Omega representatives in the gallery nod, quietly, in recognition. Then I laid out the evidence we had spent months assembling, document by document, in the same unhurried, exacting manner I would have used to authenticate a disputed manuscript for a client who doubted my judgment. I showed them the forged ink in my mother's treason record, its chemical signature 8 years too young for the date stamped above it. I showed them the falsified seal used against the monastery archive, cut from a die retired a full decade before Neris's officers had used it. I laid the fraudulent amendments to the Crown Consort Law beside the original charter itself, clause against clause, so that even nobles with no legal training could see, plainly, where language granting Omega's independent property rights and the explicit freedom to refuse a bond had been quietly excised and replaced. Neris challenged my credibility, her voice sharp enough to carry to the highest gallery, insisting that a woman who had already committed forgery once had no standing to accuse anyone else of it. I let the accusation sit in the air for a moment before answering. I forged a single word on a single charm to keep myself alive in a court that would have discarded me for the truth, I said. You forged the deaths and disgraces of an entire family to keep yourself in power. I would invite the assembly to consider which of us actually required forgiveness for our forgery, and which of us simply required consequences. The documents, laid one after another before the assembly, did not require her permission to be believed. Thalia rose. I braced myself for a claim, a declaration, some version of the ownership the entire chamber was waiting to hear. She did not give it to them. She told the assembly that I was not evidence of her fitness to rule. I was not an answer to a succession clause, not a womb belonging to the crown, not royal property to be claimed or rejected for the convenience of a constitutional deadline. She reminded them, in the same level voice she had used to reject 32 Omegas at a masquerade a year earlier, that every candidate the council had ever paraded before her had been described to her in terms of temperament and fertility and family alliance, as though a person could be reduced to a ledger entry, and that she had rejected every one of them not because she was incapable of love, as the court had so comfortably decided, but because she refused to accept a woman into a position built to erase her. Then, in a voice that did not waver, though I watched her hands, out of long habit, and saw them tighten almost imperceptibly at her sides, she told the assembled houses that she loved me, and that loving me gave her no right whatsoever to define my future on my behalf. If I stood here and claimed her as my consort, she said, I would be doing to Era Solmir exactly what this law has done to every Omega who came before her. I will not save my throne by repeating my father's crime in gentler language. She offered the assembly a choice instead. Repeal the fraudulent structure underlying the Crown Consort Law and replace it with a partnership recognized between equals, regardless of designation, or accept her abdication in full, effective that same hour, with the succession passing, in accordance with the law as it actually stood, rather than as Neris wished it to stand, to whichever candidate the assembly then chose to name. She was not bluffing. Papers already existed, prepared and signed weeks earlier, sealed and carried into the chamber by her own private secretary, that I had known nothing about until that morning, and I was furious with her for it, even as half the chamber gasped, and Neris, for the first time all morning, looked genuinely uncertain of her footing. You were prepared to give up the throne, I said to her, low enough that only she could hear it over the rising noise of the gallery. And you didn't think to tell me. This is not being decided for you, she told me quietly, before I could argue further. I am not fit to keep a crown resting on a law I now know is built on fraud. That has nothing to do with what you want, or what you'd choose for me if I let you. I have spent this entire year learning the difference between protecting you and deciding for you. This is the first time I have had the chance to prove I actually learned it. Lady Sabra, to everyone's visible shock, rose to support the reform. She was a quiet woman who had spent the entire proceeding watching from the second tier of the gallery, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular authority of someone who had never asked for the crown Neris kept trying to hand her. I did not come here today to inherit a throne built on a lie, she said, and I will not let anyone hand me one on those terms. Younger houses followed her, one delegation after another, rising to add their voices, until the older families who had spent decades benefiting from the crown consort law found themselves outnumbered on the floor of their own chamber. The Omega representatives in the gallery began, openly, to demand a vote, their chant rising until it was impossible for the presiding officer to ignore, until Neris lost the room entirely, her allies peeling away one by one as it became clear which direction the tide had turned. The law was repealed before noon, by a margin wide enough that no future assembly could easily reverse it. Neris Valtaine was removed from office within the hour and placed under formal investigation for record falsification, obstruction, and abuse of authority spanning nearly 2 decades, and the evidence, patiently gathered over so many difficult months by 2 women who had once distrusted each other on sight, was more than sufficient to convict her without a single convenient confession. She never did confess, in the end. She did not need to. My mother's conviction was formally overturned within the month. She received, posthumously, a declaration of innocence that could never restore what her imprisonment had cost either of us, though it restored, at least, her name. I was offered the Solmere title and estate in full. I kept the name because it was mine, and turned most of the land into an independent archive and legal center for people the old designation laws had harmed, because that felt truer to who I had become than any inherited hall ever could. Thalia did not propose to me the week the law changed, or the month after. She let months pass, real ones, full of arguments and repairs and the slow, unglamorous work of learning each other again without a crisis forcing the pace between us. We fought, more than once, over smaller things than treason and forged evidence, the ordinary friction of 2 stubborn women learning to share a life, whose turn it was to visit whose home, how much of my archive work she was allowed to worry about aloud, how much of her council business she was permitted to bring into an evening that was supposed to belong to neither the crown nor the kingdom. We learned, gradually, that disagreement did not have to mean danger, that raised voices did not have to end in months of silence, that we could argue about something as small as honey and still trust each other with something as large as a throne. The Crown Consort Law was replaced by a Royal Partnership Act, drafted in large part from notes I had helped compile from the original charter, that let any future royal spouse keep her name, her property, her profession, her political rights, her medical privacy, and the right, always, to refuse a bond or end a marriage freely, regardless of designation. We attended sessions, at my insistence, with a relationship advisor who was, refreshingly, entirely unintimidated by the Winter Queen, and who once told Thalia, quite calmly, that ruling a kingdom did not make her an expert on managing a partnership, a comment that left Thalia, uncharacteristically speechless, for nearly a full minute. Thalia stayed sometimes at my small apartment above the Restoration Guild and admitted, more than once, over cheap wine and takeaway food eaten straight from paper wrapping, that she preferred the ordinary creak of its floorboards and the noise of the street below to the vast, curated silence of the palace halls she had grown up inside. I stayed sometimes at the palace and discovered, gradually, that I no longer flinched at the weight of its attention on me, that I could walk its corridors as myself rather than as a woman perpetually calculating her nearest exit. When I finally let her scent me openly, it happened on an ordinary evening rather than a ceremonial one, in a quiet room with no audience and no urgency, both of us simply tired after a long day and comfortable enough, finally, to want nothing more complicated than closeness. We had talked, beforehand and more than once, about what a bond would actually mean, about the parts of myself I would keep entirely separate from it, and the parts I was choosing, freely, to share. And when it happened, I felt, more than anything, an enormous and unexpected calm, the sense of a decision made with my whole clear mind, rather than one made for me by instinct or crisis or anyone else's convenience. Almost a year to the day after the first moon masquerade, the palace hosted another. The sun chamber's outer hall looked, at first glance, almost exactly as it had that first night, the same mirrored walls doubling 1,000 candles into 10,000, the same winter flowers suspended in bowls of clear water, the same snow falling steadily beyond the tall windows onto a courtyard I now knew better than almost any place in the capital. But everything about who filled that hall had changed. This time, no 32 Omegas stood in a line to be evaluated. No families hovered anxiously at the edges of the dance floor, calculating whether their daughters had been chosen or dismissed. Guests arrived simply as themselves. Some came with partners, hands linked openly the way I would once have thought impossible inside a royal ballroom. Some came alone, content in their own company. Some wore their designations openly, in jeweled pins or embroidered collars that had once been reserved, quietly, for warning rather than pride, while others chose to disclose nothing at all, because the choice, finally and entirely, belonged to them rather than to the crown, or to a law, or to anyone standing in judgment near the dais. I wore a mask again, the same one, its silver cracks repaired now by a jeweler in the lower city, into shapes that looked, if you tilted them toward the candlelight, almost like small constellations, rather than the fractures they had once been. I was not hiding behind it. I had, if anything, grown rather fond of it, the way you grow fond of an old scar that no longer aches, and I had told the jeweler, quite plainly, that I wanted it kept rather than replaced, because some things were worth repairing instead of discarding. I stood near the same mirrored wall where I had once calculated exits, sipping a glass of the same dark wine, and let myself simply enjoy the evening for what it now was, a celebration rather than a trial. 2 of my colleagues from the public archive found me within the first hour, both grinning, both far too pleased with themselves for having correctly guessed, months earlier, exactly how this particular story was going to end. I laughed with them longer than I meant to, and it did not feel like performance at all. Thalia found me across the ballroom the way she had the first time, her attention narrowing through hundreds of layered scents, wine and perfume and candle smoke and cold night air carried in on every new arrival, until it settled, unmistakably, on mine. The same recognition crossing her face that I remembered from a year earlier, though softened now into something closer to relief than shock. But she did not cross the room like a queen selecting someone from a line, the way the whole court had once expected her to do to 32 frightened strangers. She waited, this time, at the edge of the crowd, dressed again in silver and deep gray, though without the steel half-mask she had worn before, her face entirely open to the room in a way I understood, now, had cost her something to allow. She let me be the one to walk toward her. "I believe the last time you noticed me at one of these," I said, when I finally reached her, close enough now that I could catch the familiar note of frost-crushed rosemary, beneath the crowded scent of the hall. I very nearly ended up arrested for falsifying a royal invitation. "You also broke into a state archive," she said, the corner of her mouth curving in the particular way I had spent a year learning to recognize as her version of open delight, "and accused your own queen of being the most dangerous thing in the room." "You were," I said. "I stand by the assessment." "I've been told," she said, "that assessment has since become somewhat more complicated." She asked me to dance, and this time I said yes without a moment's hesitation, and let her lead me out onto the same polished marble floor where, a year earlier, an entire ballroom had watched her cross toward a masked stranger and decided, wrongly, that they were witnessing destiny rather than the very beginning of an argument that would take both of us the better part of a year to finish having honestly. The orchestra swelled around us, the same strings, though the melody itself was new, commissioned for the occasion, I would later learn, at Thalia's own quiet request. Snow kept falling silver beyond the tall windows, exactly as it had the first night, and I found myself thinking, with a fondness that startled me, that some things really were worth returning to, provided you returned as someone different than you had left. Partway through the dance, she missed a step, which I had never once seen her do, not even the evening she had lost at fencing on purpose, and when I glanced up at her in surprise, she asked me a different question entirely, one she admitted, with a rare and thoroughly endearing flush of embarrassment, that she had rewritten more times than she cared to confess, drafting it in the margins of council papers and discarding version after version, because none of them had ever sounded like her, rather than like a queen. She did not ask me to become a crown consort in any sense the old law would once have recognized. She did not speak of destiny, or of scent, or of the succession that had once forced this entire story into motion. She asked me, instead, to remain exactly who I already was, an archivist, a restorer of things other people had given up on, a woman who argued with her about monarchy until midnight and moved honeypots out of reach without asking, and to build a life beside her as precisely that person, with nothing of myself surrendered and nothing of myself owned by anyone but me. You realize, I told her, my voice not quite steady, that you are clearly the single most formidable woman in this entire kingdom, and you still somehow manage to sound nervous, proposing to an archivist in a rented mask. I have negotiated treaties with foreign sovereigns, who frightened me less than this conversation, she admitted. Good, I said. I'd hate to think I was the easy part. Then I told her yes and watched something in her, some final held breath she had perhaps been carrying since the night she first smelled me across a crowded ballroom and did not yet know what to do with what she'd found. Finally, visibly, let go. She smelled me before she ever knew my name, that first night, and half the court believed the Winter Queen had simply found her destiny standing behind a mask. It took us a year of arguments and grief and hard-won honesty to prove them wrong about the easy part of that story and right about everything that actually mattered. I removed my mask that second night not because she asked, and not because I needed to hide any longer, but because I finally understood I had nothing left in me that required covering, and I wanted her, more than anything, to see all of it at once.